Hi, Steve Joordens, Director of the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab at University of Toronto Scarborough. Um, Carrying on the design thinking discussion, another thing that they often highlight in design thinking is what they call moonshots. And what they mean by that is they're actually stealing from JFK, John F. Kennedy, with his notion of, we can go to the moon and we can go there in 10 years. That bravado of thought, the bravado of innovation, that whole notion that in order to really be innovative, you have to tackle things that look unsolvable. And you have to be willing to just commit to solving something and then finding innovative ways to do it. So, that all sounds well and good. But I can actually give you, I think, a good example of how that can work in the context of educational innovations. So, that's what this is all about. Deep learning, thousands of students at a time. I'll come back to that. What I what I mean by this ominous looking slide is the following. Any of you who've heard me talk about Peer Scholar probably have heard me, talk about, hey, it enhances critical thinking and creative thinking and then expressive and receptive communication, all these 21st century skills, and it also enhances community in the classroom and does all this stuff. I can now speak of it in these ways and connect it to a lot of educational psychology and sort of priorities in our system, and it fits, which is really nice. But the truth is, Peer Scholar was not created with those things in mind. It was created with a much more specific and primitive thought process that I will unleash on you. So it all began when I inherited what was already a very large class. I think it was about a 300 student introduction to psychology class, but we had a number of sections of this class. And what I opted to do one year is combine all of these sections together and turn them into one very large blended learning class. And the reason I did that is I was dissatisfied with something about the class, and the only way to make changes was to kind of get control. So rather than having 5 professors teach different sections, if I brought them all together, then I could go about and change the classroom experience a little bit. Now, specifically, what I wanted to change was the assessment. Because when I inherited the course, it was 100% multiple choice. So everything the students did, the only way we assessed them was to give them multiple choice exams, which meant that the only thing we were actually assessing was their ability to memorize content. I wasn't happy with that. I was not doing educational psychology research at the time, um, but I had this thought from my own experience, a very primitive notion of educational psychology that can be summed up in these 2 words: writing good. I felt myself that I'd learned a lot by having to write my thoughts down and to structure them in certain ways. And I felt like we should be doing that in our courses too. Even a course like mine, a course at that point, which was 12 or 1300 students large, I really wanted them to be writing. And my colleagues, by the way, wanted them to be writing. My more senior colleagues would say you need to teach them to write in first year classes so that when they get to our classes, they actually know how to write. All right, so now we have our moonshot to an extent set up here. We have a very large class, and of course, we have limited resources. So, writing is typically a fairly personal thing to learn where you have somebody giving you prompt, effective feedback. That's how it works best. How can you do that 1,200 or more students at a time? Well, some people say you can't, okay? In this bravely entitled document, the definitive article on class size, Alice Horning kind of highlights something. I'm going to underline these things here. Um, I'll just read this sentence. In addition, if the goal in teaching writing is not to have students memorize grammar rules, but instead to learn through doing and getting feedback, these activities can only be accomplished in small classes where students actually do a lot of writing. I agree with the second part. The students have to do a lot of writing, but she's being very strong. You must have a small class to do this. And then a little further down here, Finally, writing courses that emphasize revision through multiple drafts. Admittedly, an area of my own research which I naturally support and which my studies show is essential to learning successful writing, that this sort of revision of writing requires small class size so that teachers can read and comment on students' work over multiple drafts. So now what we have is Alice basically saying, hey, you with your 1,200 student class, you want them writing, it's impossible. One of the things I want to highlight is you should have your ears big for that word impossible. And anytime something has two traits, one, it's considered very valuable if you could do it, and two, it's considered impossible to do, that's something. Okay, when you hear that word impossible for something valuable, that should tell you, hey, if I could solve this, then obviously there's value. There's great value, and people think it's insolvable, so it's going to be a challenge, but it's going to be a challenge that will pay off if I can meet the challenge. Okay, it's considered something very worthwhile, in this case, writing and that revisionist writing kind of approach. So this was really our goal when myself and my colleague Dwayne Paré thought up Peer Scholar, which we're now kind of known for. Our thought process was, how do we get students writing? And how do we get them writing 1,200 students at a time? And as many of you know, the solution we came up with was to have students help with the assessment part. So yes, they all wrote in a first phase, but then in a second phase, we used peer assessment. We had them literally look at each other's work and give each other feedback about how the work could be improved. And then we ultimately allowed them to see all that feedback. So, they gave feedback to, say, 5 peers, but then they get feedback as well from 5 peers. And now we tell them to inspect that feedback and to revise. So we have this revisionist writing. It now happens 1,900 students at a time. Yes, we do need, in this system that we use, we do need a TA at the end to do some grading and to give some expert comments. But we were able to bring that writing into the classroom. Again, now that I understand what we've done, I understand the power of peer assessment and all that it supports, I see this as a tool for enhancing critical thought and creative thought and communication skills and all these kinds of things I now talk about. But if you actually go to the very first paper we did on this, and if you read through it, you will see that in this paper, we don't talk a lot about all that pedagogy. We are talking more about, hey, we found a way to get writing into large classes. And in fact, in this case, we suggested that if you have enough peers marking a piece, that the average peer grade, if you will, that you get is as good as an expert grade. So in fact, if I wanted, I could have 10 or 12 written assignments in my class where we're actually using the peers as a means to get the grades for those marks, a means to provide the feedback, and the bonus is they learn so much by doing it. But yeah, since that time, I can now unpack this. Good writing is clear thinking made visible. Think about all those 21st century skills. And, as another side effect, which you may have seen me discuss in other talks, we now kind of understand that this process that we've set in place actually creates a much more personal learning situation, and so that we actually enhance feelings of community in the classroom. Fantastic. All of this came from basically refusing to believe that this was impossible. And that's really my main point. Again, impossible and valuable means something worth really thinking about. Because if you think about it well enough, sometimes the impossible becomes possible. And if you can come up with a way of doing that for something that's valuable, you've really got something. All right, so that's all I have for this part. Thank you very much. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me further.